In the damp shadows of the Pacific jungle, Japanese soldiers had always believed themselves masters of close combat. They trusted their long Arisaka bayonets, their Bushido training, and their willingness to die for the emperor. But when they faced what seemed like an ordinary weapon, the M1 Garand rifle with its bayonet attached, that confidence transformed into something far darker. Into nightmare. The distinctive ping of an empty clip ejecting from an M1 Garand echoed through the trees. Japanese soldiers, hearing this sound, believed they had found their moment. They knew what it meant. An American rifleman needed to reload. Time to charge, time to close the distance and use their superior spirit in hand-to-hand combat. But instead of finding a vulnerable soldier fumbling with ammunition, they encountered something that shattered their tactical assumptions. An American Marine or Army infantryman rushing forward with gleaming steel already fixed to his rifle, transforming the weapon from a firearm into something medieval and terrifying. The M1 bayonet was not just steel and wood. It became a symbol of brutality that infected the minds of Japanese infantrymen across every island battlefield. Wartime intelligence reports documented something remarkable. Even the most hardened soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army showed visible fear when they witnessed their comrades fall to the M1's blade. Quick, efficient, cold. This is not merely a story about a weapon. This is a story about fear that transcended trenches and bullets. Fear of close combat, where the distance between life and death collapsed to the length of a single thrust. And in that nightmare, the American soldier with his M1 bayonet cast a horrifying shadow across the entire Japanese military. The Pacific theater was hell in every measurable way. Dense jungles where visibility dropped to mere feet. Volcanic islands where the earth itself seemed to reject human presence. Heat that turned uniforms into second skins of sweat. Rain that fell not in drops but in walls of water. Malaria, dysentery, tropical diseases with names most soldiers could not pronounce but whose effects they understood intimately. In this environment, the Japanese soldier held certain advantages. They had trained for years in terrain not unlike these Pacific jungles. Their doctrine emphasized aggression, close assault, and the spiritual superiority of Japanese warrior tradition. Every soldier carried the Type 30 Arisaka rifle, and attached to it was a bayonet that measured nearly 16 inches long. Combined with the rifle itself, a Japanese soldier wielding this weapon had reach that seemed formidable. More than reach, they had centuries of martial tradition behind them. The Banzai charge was not just a tactic, it was a philosophy. Japanese soldiers believed that spiritual force could overcome material disadvantage. They believed that an enemy who valued his own life would break when confronted with men who did not fear death. And for the first months of the Pacific War, this belief seemed validated. Allied forces retreated across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Singapore, from Wake Island to the Dutch East Indies. But the American soldier brought something different to this equation, not just superior industrial capacity or better supply lines, though these mattered enormously. The American soldier brought the M1 Garand rifle, and with it, a completely different philosophy of infantry combat. Japanese soldiers knew how to use their bayonets. They drilled endlessly in the art of the thrust, the parry, the charge. But their training and their weapons were built on assumptions that worked against them in the close, chaotic combat of the Pacific Islands. Their bayonets were long, designed for reach, perfect for the open battlefields of Manchuria or China where formations could maintain coherence. In the jungle, that length became a liability. The M1 Garand changed warfare in ways most historians focus on its semi-automatic action. 8 rounds fired as fast as a trained soldier could pull the trigger, compared to the bolt-action rifles that required manual cycling between each shot. This fire superiority was enormous. One American rifleman could put out the volume of fire that previously required multiple soldiers. But the M1 bayonet, officially designated the M1905E1, changed something more fundamental about close combat psychology. It was shorter than the Japanese bayonet, measuring just 10 inches. This seemed like a disadvantage on paper. Japanese military planners, when they learned of this specification, likely felt reassured. Shorter blade meant less reach. Less reach meant their soldiers could strike first in a bayonet duel. They were catastrophically wrong. The shorter blade of the M1 bayonet made it faster. In the split seconds that decided survival in close combat, the American soldier could bring his bayonet to bear, while a Japanese soldier was still maneuvering his longer, heavier blade. The M1 bayonet attached to a rifle that weighed less than the Arisaka making the entire weapon system more maneuverable in tight spaces. In jungle combat, where visibility was measured in feet and encounters happened at arm's length, maneuverability trumped reach every single time. More than this, the M1 bayonet was designed with a different purpose. It was not primarily a dueling weapon. It was a tool for quick, brutal efficiency. The blade was thick, sturdy, capable of penetrating not just flesh but also the thick canvas webbing and equipment that soldiers wore. It could be used to pry open ammunition crates, cut through jungle vegetation, or dig fighting positions. It was practical in ways the longer Japanese bayonet was not. But the real difference was not in the steel. It was in how American soldiers were trained to use it. American bayonet training emphasized aggression and speed. There was no elaborate martial philosophy, no spiritual dimension, just brutal, practical technique. Close the distance, strike fast, move to the next target. The training recognized what actual combat had proven throughout history. Bayonet fights were not gentlemanly duels. They were savage, desperate struggles that lasted seconds. The soldier who struck first, who struck decisively, survived. When Japanese soldiers first encountered American infantrymen in close combat, they expected one thing and found another. They expected hesitation, the reluctance of men who valued their lives to close to killing distance. They expected to overwhelm through spiritual force and the terror of the banzai charge. Instead, they found American soldiers who met aggression with aggression, who did not break or retreat when Japanese infantry charged, who used the momentary pause after their rifles emptied to fix bayonets and countercharge. On Guadalcanal, in the darkness of a tropical night in August 1942, a company of Japanese soldiers prepared for a banzai charge against an American position. They had done this before. They knew the terror it created. They had seen British, Dutch, and Australian soldiers break and run when faced with screaming Japanese infantry emerging from the jungle. The charge began. Dozens of soldiers, rifles with fixed bayonets, rushing forward through the darkness. The Americans opened fire, but in the chaos and darkness, many Japanese soldiers made it through the initial fusillade. They reached the American foxholes. Close combat erupted across the perimeter. What happened next stunned the Japanese soldiers who survived. Instead of finding Americans huddled in their positions, trying desperately to reload in panic, they found Marines already moving forward with fixed bayonets. The Marines did not wait to be overrun. They countercharged. In the darkness, with muzzle flashes providing the only light, American and Japanese soldiers met in brutal hand-to-hand combat. But it was not the prolonged bayonet dueling that Japanese soldiers had trained for. It was fast, chaotic, and over in moments. American Marines, with their shorter, more maneuverable bayonets, struck quickly. Japanese soldiers found their longer bayonets difficult to wield in the close confines of the jungle undergrowth, among the foxholes and equipment that littered a defensive position. Private First Class James Mitchell, a Marine from Tennessee, later described the experience in an interview recorded by military historians. He spoke of seeing a Japanese soldier emerge from the darkness, bayonet extended. Mitchell did not have time to reload. He fixed his bayonet in one smooth motion, a movement drilled into him through endless training, and lunged forward. The shorter blade of his M1 bayonet found its mark before the Japanese soldier could bring his longer weapon to bear. Mitchell pulled the blade free and moved to the next threat. No hesitation, no thought, pure trained response. This scenario repeated across the Pacific. Japanese soldiers began to report something unexpected to their officers. They reported that American soldiers were not the soft, individualistic fighters they had been told to expect. In close combat, Americans were disciplined, aggressive, and devastatingly effective. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. The Japanese military doctrine was built on the assumption of spiritual superiority. When that assumption cracked, the entire edifice of Japanese infantry tactics began to crumble. Interrogation reports from Japanese prisoners of war, collected throughout 1943 and 1944, reveal a consistent pattern. When asked about what they feared most in combat, many prisoners mentioned the M1 bayonet. They described watching American soldiers charge forward after their rifles emptied, transforming instantly from riflemen to shock troops. They described the speed of American bayonet strikes, how their comrades fell before they could react. One captured Japanese sergeant, interviewed on Saipan, described the American bayonet as a demon weapon. He said his soldiers had lost the will to engage in banzai charges because they had seen too many of their comrades killed not by bullets or artillery, but by American steel in close combat. The psychological foundation of Japanese infantry tactics, the banzai charge, was losing its power because the men ordered to execute these charges had seen them fail too many times against American bayonets. Fear spread through Japanese units in a way that American intelligence officers noted with interest. Units that had engaged in close combat with American forces became noticeably less aggressive in subsequent encounters. They showed reluctance to press attacks when ammunition ran low. They chose to withdraw rather than fix bayonets and charge, something that would have been unthinkable in the early months of the war. This fear was not cowardice. These were still some of the most disciplined, devoted soldiers of the Second World War. But they were human, and humans respond to trauma. Watching friends and comrades fall to American bayonets created a psychological wound that even the strictest military discipline could not entirely heal. Night fighting became particularly terrifying for Japanese soldiers. In the darkness of the Pacific Islands, American infantrymen learned to use the cover of night to approach Japanese positions silently. They would move through the jungle, using the sounds of wind and rain to mask their approach, until they were within striking distance of Japanese foxholes or bunkers. On New Georgia, during operations in mid-1943, American Army Rangers developed tactics specifically designed to exploit Japanese fear of close combat. They would probe Japanese positions during the day, identifying strong points and defensive positions. Then, at night, small teams would infiltrate close to these positions. When the moment came, they would rush forward with fixed bayonets, striking before Japanese soldiers could fully react. Corporal Robert Daniels, a ranger from Montana, described one such night operation. His team moved through absolute darkness, using only touch and whispered signals to maintain formation. They knew a Japanese machine gun position was ahead, dug into the base of a large tree. The position had held up their advance during the day, its field of fire covering the only practical approach route. In the darkness, Daniels and 3 other rangers crawled to within 20 feet of the position. They could hear the Japanese soldiers talking quietly, the click of metal on metal as they maintained their weapon. Then, on a signal, the rangers rose and charged. The Japanese soldiers, surprised in the darkness, barely had time to react. Daniels thrust his M1 bayonet forward, feeling it strike home. The fight was over in seconds. The machine gun position was neutralized, not with grenades or bullets, but with steel. The psychological impact of such attacks was devastating to Japanese morale. Soldiers who survived these night raids reported feeling hunted. They described an inability to sleep, knowing that American soldiers might emerge from the darkness at any moment. The bayonet became a symbol of this fear, a weapon that could strike without warning, silent and lethal. Japanese commanders recognized the problem. They issued new tactical guidance attempting to address the effectiveness of American close combat tactics. Soldiers were instructed to maintain greater distance from American positions. Units were ordered to dig deeper, more complex defensive positions that would make American bayonet charges more difficult. Some commanders even ordered their men to remove their bayonets, reasoning that the psychological burden of preparing for close combat was damaging their soldiers' effectiveness with firearms. But these measures largely failed. The nature of Pacific Island combat made close engagements inevitable. Jungles, caves, bunker systems, and the limited size of many battlefield areas meant that battles collapsed into close-range fighting regardless of doctrine or preference. And in those close fights, American soldiers with their M1 rifles and bayonets held a consistent advantage. The Japanese military tried to counter American bayonet tactics with their own innovations. They developed close assault teams equipped with swords and shorter weapons. They attempted to use terrain more effectively to avoid situations where American soldiers could close to bayonet range. They emphasized grenade attacks and other weapons that could engage at very close range without requiring hand-to-hand combat. Some of these tactics worked in specific situations, but overall, the trend was clear. Japanese infantry was losing the close combat dominance they had enjoyed early in the war. American soldiers, equipped with M1 rifles and bayonets, trained in aggressive tactics, and psychologically prepared for brutal close fighting, were winning these encounters more often than not. For American soldiers, the M1 bayonet became more than just a weapon. It became a symbol of their effectiveness, a source of psychological strength. Veterans described the feeling of confidence that came from knowing they had an answer to the banzai charge. They were not helpless when their rifles ran dry. They could fight and win in close combat. Sergeant William Thompson, an Army infantryman from Ohio who fought through New Guinea and the Philippines, kept a journal throughout the war. His entries reveal the psychological importance of the bayonet. He wrote about the comfort of feeling the weight of the bayonet in his pack, knowing it was there if needed. He described watching Japanese soldiers recoil when they saw American troops fix bayonets, how that visible reaction boosted American morale. Thompson wrote about a particular engagement in the Philippines where his platoon was running low on ammunition during a prolonged firefight. The order came to fix bayonets. Thompson described the transformation that came over his fellow soldiers. Men who moments before had shown signs of fear or exhaustion suddenly became aggressive, focused. The act of fixing bayonets was not just preparation for close combat. It was a psychological trigger, switching American infantrymen from a defensive to an offensive mindset. The Japanese soldiers facing Thompson's platoon apparently recognized what fixed bayonets meant. According to Thompson's journal, the Japanese fire slackened. Some soldiers retreated from their positions rather than face an American bayonet charge. The platoon advanced and secured their objective without firing another shot. The mere threat of the M1 bayonet had been enough. This psychological dynamic worked in both directions. It built confidence in American soldiers while eroding confidence in Japanese soldiers. Over time, this psychological shift had strategic implications. Japanese commanders could no longer rely on the banzai charge as a decisive tactical option. American defensive positions could not be broken through sheer aggression and spiritual force. The material and tactical advantages that America brought to the Pacific War were reinforced by a psychological edge in close combat. The impact of the M1 bayonet extended beyond individual encounters. It influenced the course of entire battles and campaigns. At Tarawa, American Marines faced some of the most determined Japanese resistance of the war. Japanese soldiers fought from fortified positions with suicidal determination, but in the final stages of the battle, when Marines had to clear bunkers and trenches one by one, the M1 bayonet proved decisive. Marines would suppress a bunker with grenades and rifle fire, then assault with fixed bayonets. The speed and decisiveness of these assaults, the willingness of Marines to close to killing distance without hesitation, broke the last Japanese resistance. Survivors of Tarawa on both sides remembered the close combat, the bayonet work that characterized the final hours of the battle. At Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, the pattern repeated. Japanese soldiers fought with incredible courage and determination. But when combat collapsed into close quarters, American infantrymen with M1 bayonets consistently prevailed. The psychological impact of this consistent pattern accumulated. Japanese soldiers, even the most fanatical, began to show signs of doubt when facing American bayonet charges. Intelligence officers analyzing captured documents and prisoner interrogations noticed this shift. Japanese military communications showed increasing concern about close combat effectiveness. Training guidance changed, emphasizing the need to avoid situations where American soldiers could close to bayonet range. This defensive mentality represented a fundamental shift from the aggressive, attack-oriented doctrine that characterized the Japanese military early in the war. The M1 bayonet's psychological impact was amplified by its integration into the broader American system of infantry combat. American soldiers did not rely solely on the bayonet. They used it as part of a combined arms approach that included superior firepower, better communication, and more flexible tactics. The bayonet was the final tool, the weapon of last resort when all others had been expended. But it was a tool American soldiers knew how to use effectively, and that knowledge gave them confidence throughout the entire tactical engagement. Japanese soldiers, in contrast, had built much of their tactical doctrine around the assumption of superiority in close combat. When that assumption proved false, it undermined their entire approach to infantry fighting. They found themselves at a disadvantage in both firepower exchanges and close combat. This dual disadvantage was psychologically devastating. The legacy of the M1 bayonet extended beyond the Second World War. Veterans on both sides carried memories of close combat for the rest of their lives. American veterans spoke with pride about their effectiveness with the bayonet, about their ability to meet and defeat the banzai charge. Japanese veterans spoke more quietly, but their memories were equally vivid. Many described the M1 bayonet as the weapon they feared most, more than artillery or aerial bombardment. The personal, intimate nature of bayonet combat made it particularly traumatic. In the broader history of the Pacific War, the M1 bayonet occupies a unique place. It was not the weapon that won the war. American victory came through naval supremacy, air power, industrial capacity, and the development of increasingly sophisticated amphibious assault tactics. But the M1 bayonet played a crucial role in the ground combat that characterized every Pacific Island battle. It gave American infantrymen a decisive edge in the close, brutal fighting that was unavoidable in the Pacific theater. The psychological dimension of this edge was perhaps more important than the physical. War is fought as much in the mind as on the battlefield. When Japanese soldiers lost confidence in their ability to prevail in close combat, they lost a fundamental pillar of their military doctrine. The banzai charge, once a terrifying and often effective tactic, became a desperate measure that soldiers executed with decreasing conviction. American soldiers, meanwhile, gained confidence with each successful bayonet engagement, reinforcing their tactical aggressiveness and psychological resilience. The M1 bayonet thus became a weapon that transcended its physical properties. It was steel and wood, 10 inches of sharpened blade attached to one of history's finest infantry rifles. But it was also a psychological weapon, a tool that shaped the minds of soldiers on both sides of the conflict. For Japanese infantrymen, it became a source of fear, a symbol of their inability to dominate close combat as they had expected. For American soldiers, it became a source of confidence, a weapon that proved they could meet and defeat the enemy on his own terms. In the final accounting, the terror that Japanese infantry felt toward the M1 bayonet was not irrational. It was based on repeated, traumatic experiences. They had seen their comrades fall to American steel. They had felt their own tactical doctrines fail in the face of American close combat effectiveness. They had experienced the psychological shock of meeting an enemy who would not break, who would not retreat, who would charge forward with fixed bayonets and win the desperate, close-range battles that decided the fate of islands and ultimately the war itself. The damp jungles of the Pacific Islands swallowed countless stories. Most of them died with the men who lived them, buried in unmarked graves or consumed by the jungle itself. But the story of the M1 bayonet survived because it touched something fundamental about the nature of war and human fear. It was a reminder that in the end, after all the artillery and aerial bombardment, after all the tactical planning and strategic maneuvering, wars are still fought by individual soldiers willing to close to killing distance. And in the Pacific War, American soldiers with M1 bayonets proved themselves willing and able to do exactly that, breaking the spirit of an enemy who had believed themselves invincible in the very type of combat they had mastered. The lessons extended beyond military history. The M1 bayonet story illuminated how psychological factors can be as decisive as material ones in warfare. Superior equipment matters, but the will to use that equipment effectively matters even more. Training matters, but so does the psychological resilience to execute that training under the most extreme stress imaginable. Fear matters, and a military force that can impose fear on its enemy while maintaining its own cohesion holds an enormous advantage. For the soldiers who carried the M1 bayonet, who fixed it to their rifles and charged into close combat in the jungles and caves of the Pacific Islands, the weapon was intensely personal. It required them to look into the eyes of the enemy, to feel the resistance of flesh against steel, to know in the most direct way possible that they had taken a life. This intimacy made bayonet combat uniquely traumatic for those who experienced it. But it also created a unique bond among those who survived. They had faced the ultimate test of infantry combat and prevailed. For the Japanese soldiers who faced those American bayonets, the weapon represented the collapse of their military's foundational assumptions. They had been told they were superior warriors, that their spirit would overcome material disadvantages, that the banzai charge was an invincible tactic. The M1 bayonet proved all of these assumptions wrong in the most direct, visceral way possible. That realization, that psychological defeat, spread through Japanese infantry units as surely as any physical wound. In the end, the story of the M1 bayonet in the Pacific War is a story about human beings under impossible stress, making split-second decisions that determined life and death. It is a story about fear and courage, about tactical innovation and psychological warfare. It is a story about how a relatively simple piece of military equipment, well designed and properly employed, can have effects far beyond its physical specifications. The ghost that American soldiers with M1 bayonets cast over the Japanese military was real. It lived in the minds of Japanese infantrymen who had seen too many of their comrades fall to American steel. It influenced tactical decisions at every level of command. It changed the character of the Pacific War in ways both subtle and profound. And it left a legacy that both American and Japanese veterans carried with them long after the war ended, a memory of close combat in dark jungles, of steel meeting flesh, the moment when training and instinct and fear collided in the space of a single heartbeat.